Colonel Douglas Macgregor is a retired, although he's a pretty active retiree, US Army colonel. He's an author and he is a foreign policy and defense consultant. He's actually something of a sage. And long ago, he would have been a compatriot of mine from land not far from where I'm broadcasting to you right now in the Scottish Highlands. Douglas Macgregor joins us now from the United States. Colonel Macgregor, I'm always grateful for your wisdom. I follow you on all platforms. Let me put to you, if I may, the payoff line of a call I just took from Florida. The clue was in the flags that they flew. Dumbo the elephant and a jackass. Is that what you thought when you saw the Congress waving their Ukrainian flags yesterday?
Well, first, congratulations on your new job. I'm sure you're a breath of fresh air in London. Thank you so much, Colonel. The second thing is, I think your caller had a point, although I would currently say that we have a government that consists of 525 lobbyists as opposed to representatives. People who are all busy lobbying for money with which they can line their pockets. Now, some of them are just ignorant, which would fall into the donkey character. Some are destructive, which would follow the elephant. But all of them, I'm afraid, with very few exceptions, are bought men, which explains why we are following the policies that we are.
It is extraordinary that it's come to that, Colonel. The United States has often surprised us with the low caliber of its top political representatives. But looking at Joe Biden in the White House and looking at that nest of lobbyists yesterday, I think ineluctably we must reach the conclusion that this is the worst it's ever been, don't you think?
Oh, I think it is. It's hard to imagine it getting any worse, but every time I think it can get worse, it does. Friends of mine inside Washington now refer to Washington as Epstein Island Large. Epstein Island, as you know, is the place where people were set up with underage girls. And it looks like enough of them have been involved in it that they're all blackmailed. And of course, that was Tucker Carlson's most recent allegation, that people on the Hill who lead sadly bizarre lives are blackmailed. And if that's the case, they could be compelled to vote in whatever direction the very wealthy and powerful oligarchs in the United States. I say oligarch because someone who's a billionaire hedge fund manager can just as easily buy policy outcomes as an oligarch in Russia or Ukraine. So I think that's our biggest problem. The only way that it will end is with some form of financial collapse, which many of us think is going to happen.
It's time for a new American revolution, isn't it?
Well, the only time you get a revolution, really, let's be frank, is when the population can't eat. That's when we got the French Revolution. And the problems the French Revolution confronted had been around for years. It was only after the population of Paris could not afford to buy bread. I think we could confront a similar situation in the United States with the disruption of supply chains and the destruction of our economy. We're currently living on income that is at least 50% or close to 50% of government income. In other words, the so-called GDP is an illusion. It's something in the neighborhood of less than half of what it appears to be. This can't go on forever. I mean, it just cannot. We just don't know when it's going to happen, but something is going to come along and tip us over. And when that happens, there will be an opportunity to clean house and hopefully start over and put an end to this unnecessary overseas empire that you and your previous caller were talking about.
You need a Hercules to clean the Augean stable. Like me, you're getting on a little. Is there anyone in the wings, younger than you and me, that's capable of doing that job?
Well, we don't know. I think so, but I'm not sure. My point is that until these events happen, you rarely know who's going to surface. After all, in 1789, Napoleon Bonaparte was an unknown captain in the French army with very poor prospects. All of that within 10 years changes dramatically, and he ends up being the proconsul of France. Now, I'm not predicting the emergence of a Napoleon, and I'm one of these people that really dislikes the notion that any one candidate is going to rescue us. I keep telling people in all my presentations, stop talking about Donald Trump or RFK Jr. or anybody else saving us. You've got to save yourselves. And I think Americans are beginning to figure it out. But we've got a long way to go, and Americans are not well informed. A lot of them aren't interested. They're too busy trying to put bread on the table. Others simply take in the usual nonsense from the mainstream media. So I would say right now, perhaps a third fully understand what's happening in the country and the dangers abroad. But that's about it.
Let's turn to the fruits of yesterday's labors. About $80 billion for Taiwan, for Netanyahu, and above all for Zelensky. His coke dealer must be delighted.
It's depressing beyond words because none of this is going to make any difference to the outcome in Ukraine. Sergei Lavrov, the very able foreign minister of Russia, spoke just 24 hours ago and made it clear that if there were any negotiations, that would be fine with them, but that the Russian army would continue to advance and they would complete their task, which is to effectively demilitarize Ukraine, denazify it, and ultimately control the territory that they think is necessary for their national security. So I think we've lost this competition in Ukraine. I'm talking about Washington and its bid to put in a puppet government and threaten Russia. And I think the end of NATO is on the horizon. I think even the Europeans, who are even more misguided and utterly confused than much of the American population, they are going to realize that there's no future in this relationship between us and them, that they too have to save themselves, that they'll have to chart a new destiny for themselves. So I think that'll be the end of NATO. The Russians will then demilitarize what remains of Ukraine. I don't think they'll occupy it or try to govern it, but they will ensure that it's completely demilitarized and can never threaten Russia again. The question then is what happens in the Middle East? And in the Middle East, we're not sure that we're going to escape a major war in that region. Every time we think we may have put a new policy on the rails, we discover that the policy is being shattered by Mr. Netanyahu, who ultimately seems to exert a great deal more influence in Washington than Mr. Biden.
What do you think to Garland Nixon's thesis that all of this clucking that we see being briefed to the media about differences between Biden and Netanyahu is simply a ruse, and that the United States government is actually fully behind what Netanyahu has done and is going to do?
I think they're half right. First of all, I think until recently it was unconditional support for Israel. Then I think the reality has begun to set in with some of the senior people behind the scenes that are instructing Biden and controlling the Congress that there's a very real potential for a major war that would draw in Russia and China and other countries and could, frankly, destroy Israel and fatally harm us. And so now I think there's a sense of helplessness, and that helplessness leads to pleas for cooperation with Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu did not get what he wanted, which was a war with Iran. So that's a good thing. That doesn't end the probability of future war with Iran for Israel and us, but at least it's a breathing space. The bad news is he continues to enjoy unconditional support for this program of mass expulsion and murder in Gaza. And as we see within the last 24 hours, 26 people were killed in bombings last night, most of whom I'm told are children. So this nonsense continues, and no one is willing to stand up and stop it. It's a condition of moral bankruptcy in London and in Washington that is clearly without precedent, I would say.
I respect all of that and agree with almost all of it too. But I think we have to consider the shift in paradigm, Colonel. We've, until now, worried about the fact that Israel wanted a war with Iran. We may be entering an era in which Iran might want a war with Israel. If there is an all-out massacre in Rafah, for example, I now no longer believe that Iran will sit back and watch that, but will in fact use that as a launch pad for hegemony across the Muslim world.
Well, there's certainly evidence to support your assertion. I don't think that Iran is delusional in the sense that it thinks it could be the dominant force in the Islamic world because it sits next to Turkey, and the Turks are certainly not going to tolerate that. I think what we're really seeing, in addition to Iran, is the broader Muslim world coalesce. What hasn't happened yet is that some of the governments that have been dragging their feet, like the Kingdom of Jordan, the government in Egypt, they're not the only ones. I'm not sure they will last much longer because their populations will demand action. And when they don't get it, they'll remove the government. I think Mr. Erdogan has changed his behavior recently because he lost badly in Turkish elections, at least in part for his failure to engage decisively against the Israelis. So I think we're going to see more of the Muslim world engaged than we've seen in centuries. So that much Mr. Netanyahu has achieved. The question is, what do we do? And we seem to be inept and powerless to exert any influence, largely because of what we've been discussing. The people that were cheering and waving the Ukrainian flags are bought men, or they're simply fools. I think that's a pretty good description.
Yeah, fools or knaves or both, of course. That's a possibility also. Again, much of what you say I concur with. I just think that the military balance of power is beginning to shift. That Iran is a very powerful actor indeed, with far more soft power than Israel and maybe equivalent hard power. What do you say to those that speculate that Iran's newfound confidence in dealing with Israel is because they've already got themselves nuclear weapons?
You know, every intelligence agency with any degree of credibility that's looked at it has made it very clear that Iran is at most a threshold state. In other words, if they decided to build nuclear warheads, they could do it pretty rapidly. But thus far, we don't have any evidence that they have. I think we should also consider that Pakistan has promised nuclear warheads to Mr. Erdogan in the event that he thinks he needs them. And it would be very easy to get those to Turkey and for the Turks to mount them on missiles. So I think Israel's in a very difficult position. And what worries me is that instead of coming to terms with reality that this mass murder and expulsion policy is the death knell of Israel, and instead stopping it and seeking a way out of this terrible mess that they've created, that they themselves will decide to use a nuclear weapon. Mr. Erdogan has said so publicly, and others in the region have also said they know what the Israelis have, and the Israelis have made it very clear on numerous occasions that they are willing to use it. That would be disastrous. At that point, I think all bets are off, and that really would be the end of the Israeli state. But I wouldn't exclude that happening first.
Now, you were a Washington insider as well as a distinguished military man. You counseled President Trump. You know how the Beltway works. And so I ask you candidly, I know it's embarrassing for Americans, but have you ever seen a president like Joe Biden, who, as we would say back in your native Scotland, could scarcely bite his own nails, This is a man you wouldn't send out for a loaf, and yet he's got his finger on your nuclear triggers.
The only ready comparison I can come up with is the last year in office of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because if you look at his reelection, he was dead or dying when he was reelected, and he was in no position to cope with the advance of the Soviet armies under Stalin into Europe and the eventual conquest and occupation of half of Europe and the world by communism. And so he was a disaster. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. He brought us to a disastrous end of the Second World War, and we're dealing with someone now who is eminently incapable of coping with the reality of what you and I have been discussing. However, there are others behind Biden who are not total fools. What they are, I would say, is simply amateurs. They've been playing at everything as though America is still what it was in 1991. They are ignoring the open borders, which they have deliberately created to dilute our population and essentially erase the American culture and national identity. They are the ones who are releasing criminals onto the street by destroying the justice system. They've ruined the armed forces in terms of morale and capability. It's at an all-time low. So you add that to the equation, and the only thing I can see ahead for the United States right now is total disaster. So perhaps someone will wake up and suddenly realize that the combination of stupidity overseas and self-flagellation at home or suicidal policies at home, somebody has to make a decision to stop one or the other. And I suspect there will be some people who will step forward and say, it's time to pull in overseas. But there's no guarantee. Thus far, there's a lot of self-delusion. You know, we're not 1991. We're not the nation we were. And they don't seem to want to recognize that. They still think that there's no one who can challenge us militarily. All they need to do is take a long look at Russia and figure out that's not true. Then look at Iran, look at Turkey, look at the rest of the region. The assumption that these countries are backward, that they don't have people of high intelligence and ability, that they are not technologically sophisticated, is fundamentally wrong. But that stupidity persists inside the Beltway. We grossly underestimate everyone, and we overestimate ourselves.
Well, that's a great note to end on, a great pearl of wisdom. You and I are both spring chickens compared to Joe Biden. I'm back in office. Shouldn't you be running for office, Colonel?
I don't think so. I'm not clever like you, George. You're a much better political figure and a better political thinker than I am. I'm a lifelong professional soldier, and I still trust too many people and believe they're honest when they're not. I'd fail miserably in politics.
Colonel Macgregor, you certainly don't fail as our blue chip guest on the mother of all talk shows. Thanks for your wisdom once again.